You get me, got you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, got you. You get me, feel it, you. You get me, got you. You get me.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Of course, remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow, rate, review, do all the things. You know where to find us. We have the links in the show notes to make it easy to find. It really does help. I ask this every time, but it's worth mentioning again because it really does help so that folks can find us and we can continue having conversations just like the one we're having today with the Reverend Dr. Serene Jones. Serene Jones is the president of the historic Union Theological Seminary, the very same Union Theological Seminary that, as Reverend Mark Thompson pointed out in a conversation I recently heard them have, Dietrich Bonhoeffer attended, and where Dr. Martin Luther King longed to one day teach. Reverend Dr. Jones is the first woman to head this 180-year-old institution, and she also occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. She is the past president of the American Academy of Religion and is the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace and Call It Grace, among others. And I usually don't include these parts, but I have to just because it's so endearing. She is a child of the Oklahoma Plains, a daughter of a university president, and a single mother, a sister, a cancer survivor, a theologian, a minister, a news commentator, a public intellectual, and a devoted teacher. Thank you for joining me today. How are you?
That list of things is, I try to live up to them, but usually come only, inches towards them. But it's good to be here. And thank you for the invitation to have the conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, my titles usually just include Jew from Jersey who became a Christian and diehard Mets fan. I don't know what else to say. So yours is
I
very
am a
interesting.
Sooner fan. I have to say that, put that out there. So
Oh man, wait, I should know this because I'm a Auburn fan. My wife's from Alabama, so I follow. Are they SEC now? Is Oklahoma SEC now? Yeah,
yeah.
longtime Big Ten, right? So I don't have that
Yes.
too far off. Yeah. All right.
Yes.
Okay. So at least now I know that nobody's perfect. OU, but yeah. Anyway, well,
We
it also
both have our problems.
seriously. Well, I was sharing before we hit record how it, having conversations like this is almost unfair because I feel like I've had the opportunity to get to know you, know your story, know your family's story, and you're just getting to know me now. So you're taking a lot more risk than I am at this endeavor. But in all seriousness, in your book, Call It Grace, which I highly commend to anyone. It's not just a memoir. It's like my experience of it is it was braiding the moments of Serene's life with this pursuit of theological understanding. It was really it's really profound. And at one point you say, the prairie faith that hold together my child confidence in God's grace was blown about like tumbleweed. Um, and I've heard a lot of, I'll call them, for lack of a better word, salvation stories, but they usually go something along the lines of, I accept Jesus into my heart at 10:44 a.m. on July 6, 1984, never look back. And your faith journey is just different. So I was just hoping that you could share some of that with us, just so we can all get to know you a little bit.
Oh, thank you for that question. Um, I mean, my faith journey may not be what people are used to hearing, but in my tradition, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, it's a pretty ordinary journey. It's a it's a Christian denomination that has always encouraged asking questions, engaging faith with all of yourself, and going into all of the corners of yourself and your faith, and not seeing it like a prison that you are bound by, but rather a space of love and grace that you can live in. And that's what I try to unfold in the book, beginning with being the child, fourth generation Oklahoma,
Mm.
where my great grandparents were Sooners, and originally settled in the state. And now I have two generations behind me, so we have six generations of Sooners. and literally Sooners in that regard. But the story of my own faith development growing up in the family, my father was a university president, but also a theologian and a minister. And faith was always a very important part of my upbringing. We were not only regular churchgoers, but really involved in church leadership at a local level and at a denominational level. And I tell people I have this unusual Christian faith upbringing story in which until I stepped into my full adulthood and began to ask huge questions about Christianity that I still wrestle with and remain a Christian. But I had a very healthy, wonderful childhood in the church. The church was the place where I learned to think about democracy and what does it mean to live in this nation as a democracy. It's where I learned about things like immigration as my church would visit migrant camps to help bring food in Oklahoma. And it's where I learned everything I know about sex, drugs, and rock and roll was at church.
That's great.
So, so I grew up in a very warm and embracing community that didn't see any part of our lives as something that should be cordoned off from faith, and
Mm,
rigorous, open, intellectual and personal conversations about God, about Jesus, about what it means to be faithful. And at the center of that was always, and this is why I think I ended up at a place like Union, that our faith calls us, like Jesus, to proclaim the news of God's liberating love for the world, which is news that also drives us to care for the world.
mm. Now, do you think that your faith or your theological formation was the result of the church, the denomination, or your dad was very creative and very thoughtful in the way that he raised you? And now, correct me if I get the pronunciations wrong, but I love your sisters' names as well. You're Serene, and your sisters are Verity and Kindy.
Hindi.
Kindy. Okay.
Yes.
So even the naming of you and your sisters seems to be a thoughtful act, like a theological act in a way. So was it more because of your dad or the church, or kind of a combination of all the above?
Well, I can say one thing about our names is his name, he's now passed away, was Joe Jones, and he
Yeah.
was determined that we would not have ordinary names like that,
Okay.
much more ordinary. Um, but it was a combination of having him as a father, someone who's a trained theologian.
Hmm.
Um, so I was learning to say Kierkegaard to pronounce it correctly by the time I was 4. Um,
Wow. I don't I think I just learned something. I've been saying Kierkegaard or something along those lines, but I have to check that and
yeah,
make
we
sure I'm
also had to
pronouncing it
say
right.
Schleimacher over and over again, Schleimacher. So, um, but no, I did grow up with major theologians of the Christian tradition as like people sitting at the table with us,
Mm,
which is why I wrote the book. I do believe these major figures are meant to sit at the table with us, and their insights are meant to illumine our lives.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's interesting because I think when I became a Christian, something that I missed and then reincorporated into my life growing up in a we went to an Orthodox synagogue, a very observant Jewish family, is that I felt like we were not only sitting at the table with my family, not only sitting, say, the Seder, which was about a month ago, sitting at the table with the characters of the Exodus, the Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and kind of growing up with these characters very much in my the front of my brain and my imagination, but sitting with the story that I was a part of and the family that I was a part of. My bar mitzvah invitations went out and they said, as my father and grandfather before me. And it wasn't coincidental that from that time forward, as soon as I could drive and go to my grandparents myself, I would spend hours and hours at my grandparents' house hearing the stories of my grandfather's upbringing in Brooklyn, my grandmother's upbringing in what's now Ukraine, but she called it Russia, part of the Russian, empire. Um, and hearing you talk about theologians, sitting at the table with theologians reminds me of that.
Mhm.
Um,
Yes, if we are, and I think this is one of the great losses in our nation as we see the decline of participation in religious communities. But when you're held by a religious community as you're growing, the stuff, the characters from that form your imagination become part of you, and that deep formation is what sustains you over time.
right.
And it can change, it could grow, it can develop, but um, it's very, I think, difficult to navigate life without any kind of story that brings together knowledge of who you are as a family, what your history is, and what you actually believe about the world.
Yeah. Now that you said something when you were first sharing your own story, that you were welcomed to ask questions. Now, when I first became a Christian, it seemed to me that questions were welcome to an extent. As long as you um, arrived at and then memorized the right answers. you know so okay, love your question. We're not used to this many questions. Listen, I'm a Jew, so this is what we're going to do, and then we're going to argue, and I'm going to argue with myself. But like, I went to a Baptist church for the first 10, 15 years I was a Christian, and no, this is the answer. Now we're
Yes.
done with that, right? The
And
serious
you're not
what,
allowed to argue with God.
that's right. That's right. Well, the serious part of that is I wonder if that style of gosh, what's the word for that? Where okay, here's the answer, we're done. If that kind of forms the way we not just what we think, but the way we think, and kind of deprives us of one of the main ways that we love God with our mind. I wonder if now we're seeing some of the products of that, or do you think I'm making too much of that?
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I think that if you grow up in a context where faith and is not uh, a part of you that shuts off your intellect or
Mm,
shuts off your emotions or shuts off how you're making meaning of the world around you, then your faith is not very strong. And the minute it engages your intellect, your feelings, your history, it's going to be filled with questions because our lives are ongoing big questions.
yeah,
And faith that's not equipped to deal with that head on is not a faith worth its weight. And I was always encouraged to ask those questions. Actually, it's a sign of faith to be serious enough to really push hard.
yeah.
Uh, and we see constantly figures in scripture that are pushing hard
Mm.
against the edges.
Okay,
Um,
I I wasn't going to do this, but if you'll indulge me for a second, I came across I read the Bible every day, and occasionally I come across a passage or a verse that haunts me, and I'm gonna take advantage of sitting here with a world-renowned theologian, and see if I'm onto something here. We're taking a little bit of a detour, so bear with me. Um, so I'm going through the minor prophets, and sometimes I just speed through it. I don't get the you know, some of the stuff where it sounds like he's trying to interpret a dream, and I don't know. I just Revelation is hard for me, and some of the stuff that I'm reading, and all the destruction, and God's angry, and all that. I honestly, candidly, just kind of speed through some, but sometimes a passage jumps out at me. And this one, it's from Micah 4. And the reason I think it's sticking with me is because I was relating it to what's happening right now. So I'll just read the passage if you'll bear with me. The passage, it starts in 4:1. And it will come about in the last days that the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as the chief of the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and the peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come and let's go up the mountain of the Lord and to the house of the God of Jacob, so that he may teach us about his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For from Zion will go forth the law and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and render decisions for mighty distant nations, and they will beat their swords into plowshares." That's a phrase that a lot of folks are familiar with, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not lift a sword against nation, and never again will they retrain for war. Instead, each of them will sit under his vine and under his fig tree, with no one to make them afraid, because the mouth of the Lord of armies has spoken. Though all the peoples walk, each in the name of his God, as for us, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. A lot has been jumping out at me here. One is, if there is uh, a common deference, if you will, it's to a law, right? So this was something unique that the people of Israel introduced, is one God and the law to bind us, that we could all agree upon, a basic law like the Noahitic commands. Um, something else is something else that really jumped out at me is that the Christian tradition that I came up in after I became a Christian is more, no, you have to kind of agree on these things, and you can't go and work like this thing about each in the name of his God. No, 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 that's a bad thing. Now you accept, our prescription, and this, you said this fancy prayer, this this fancy prayer that'll get you to heaven. You can't turn back now, and this whole thing about each in the name of his God. So I don't know. Am I onto something here, or how does that all strike you?
I mean, that's a wonderful passage. And it's one of those passages um, that anyone who thinks they've figured it all out has to grapple with,
Mm,
because first of all, it does make clear that it's by no means downplaying what it means to be part of the faith tradition that holds this scripture sacred, um, and that the law is a part of that. Which always, when I think of the law, I think in particular of the first two commandments, that thou shalt love God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself. And then you see in that passage what flows from that. And in particular, having faith in the loving grace of God, and then loving your neighbor as a sibling in God, leads us to not want to kill each other.
right. That's a good start, right? Yeah, yeah.
And beat your swords into plowshares. I mean, what a beautiful image that is.
Yeah. I
Uh,
guess I guess maybe I was reading it one of those days that something happened where the current administration did something to blow up out the alliances that we've had um, for the last 80 years or so. And I was wondering, man, there's been general agreement that, for example, you know, a large power doesn't invade a neighboring democracy, things like that. And we could support that. We could support, our allies that are democratic, however imperfect they may be. We can agree on that, right? So maybe that's what was rolling around in my noggin when I read this passage, that there are certain things that we can agree upon, like love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as the Hebrew would be thine own soul. And these things all seem to be up for grabs now, as if there are other imperatives like, having a sufficient degree of hatred for them, that's more important than loving your neighbor as thine own soul. So,
yes.
yeah.
Definitely, you don't find in that passage anything about empathy being a sin or
Mm,
empathy being a problem. Actually, it's about what happens when, on top of empathy, you build love and grace, and the nations can can peacefully dwell together.
right.
I mean, I can't help today but just think about the outbreak in between India and Pakistan. Just really, it's heartbreaking to see the level of conflict that's being stirred globally. And and then frankly, it's in the face of the passage you just read, it's disturbing to me, and I have a lot of conversations about it with people who I agree with and who I don't agree with, that even the possibility of imagining love and grace as the things that determine how we behave as a nation should have a place at the table seems to be like an absurdity, treated as if you're absurd. And you're treated as if you're absurd by other Christians who think
Right.
it should be at the table. And I always want to say, have you read your scriptures lately?
Yeah.
Have you just even picked up the Bible lately? On every page, the orphan, the widow, care for the poor, a call for peace, love, what justice means is just there everywhere.
Right. Yeah, I'm always happy to go to the Word. But that's another question that I had. But one of the ways that you put it in the beginning of your the same book, forgive me, the Call It Grace. Sorry. One of the ways that you put it was, I also believe that theology is not just a personal endeavor. It is about truths that pertain to the whole of reality. With truths that big, conversation and openness are not just good, they're a theological necessity. So my question is, including our friends who wear the red hats, including our friends that, just do want to kill us just because we're not, we are one of them and not one of them.
Yes. Yeah. No, I firmly believe that for questions that big, it requires an openness, a
Mm,
radical openness. And the first step it requires is, and this is even before conversation, but it makes conversation possible, is even for the person that you disagree with most vociferously and with a passion you disagree with them. As a Christian, I have to first affirm the love of God for them and therefore my love for them as a human being. That has to set the stage for the conversation. And we're not allowed as Christians just to say to each other, well, I disagree with you, therefore, I'm going to write you off, because God hasn't written anybody off.
it's one thing to write someone off. It's another thing to say, I'm not the man for the job. You know what I mean? Like, I think there's something here where maybe it's just I recognize that I'm putting myself in harm's way. And not that that's, I don't know, that not that that's necessarily the disqualifying factor, because, some of our heroes put themselves in harm's way. But knowing one's own boundaries, I guess, is a better way to put it. So where is there a line? And if so, where might that be? Is it just something each individual has to determine for one's own sake?
Well, I think ultimately each of us does determine it for our own sake. But if we're part of a questioning and lively congregation, we should also have communities that we think together with about this, that we're never by ourselves.
Mm,
And faith doesn't work like that. It's not sort of like an isolated, I only talk to myself about it. We need to be having internal conversations with one another about the faith and the questions we have. And if we're not even talking to people we agree with,
yeah,
it makes it even more difficult to clear the space to have the conversations where there might be very serious and substantial differences, and where you draw the line in terms of what you can do, what you're capable of doing, is really going to have to depend on the issue and on your own internal strength.
yeah,
And it's not a weakness to not be able at times to have conversations, and they're hardest when they're with people you love.
yeah, yeah. Absolutely. The people that are closest to us, that those are the ones that wake me up at 3 a.m. that is, oh God,
Yeah.
like it just um, keep rolling around in my brain to how we can mostly it's just how can I continue this conversation? And oftentimes it's examining the way I've messed it up. Sometimes it is that I've put myself in harm's way and I've been emotionally injured in some way, or something along those lines, or I just messed it up because I went about it the wrong way and I'm kicking myself for not having lived up to my own standards. But I guess with the people that we love, I err on the side of living to fight another day. Not fight, but living to love another day, I guess, is a better way to put it, you know?
Yes.
So I opened I I'm cheating a little bit here because I was talking to a couple of good buddies of mine, several dear friends, and several of them were eager to ask you questions as well. So this is one of them.
Okay.
A dear friend of mine named Tommy Givens. He's a professor of New Testament studies at Fuller, and he's just a theological rabble rouser. He asked one of his questions: what is the public significance and force of Christian theology, especially right now?
Well, there's a double answer to that. Actually, there's probably three answers to that. One is in terms of just Christian thinking. I think in large swaths of our country, it's been weaponized and is being used for very destructive purposes that veer away from the faith that I proclaim. I think secondly, the role of Christian theology for Christians and for people who even want to understand how this nation came to be and how it's grown and been transformed over the years. Understanding the basic tenets of Christianity is absolutely essential. Even if you don't profess them, it's absolutely essential. And we don't talk about the theological underpinnings of democracy, for instance, enough. That the whole notion of a political system that is democratic comes out of a Christian faith tradition in the Reformed Church. I happen to be a scholar of Calvin, in which if you recognize that every human being is equal in terms of their being loved by God, and all of us are equally capable of being gloriously wonderful and terrible and awful,
The saints and the sinners thing.
the
Yeah.
saints and the sinners, then this is the kind of political system you want because it has built into it all of our voices being heard and valued, and yet checks and balances because we're never going to completely agree with each other because we have different ways of approaching it, and we're saints and sinners both.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so,
Now,
yeah,
some,
but no, just a third answer is
sure, sure.
I think that for many Christians in the United States, and I wrote Call It Grace for this purpose, do not take time to learn from the wisest thinkers that have wrestled with what faith means. And in this book, I open up the theologian's perspective and then try to show how it changed my life to understand the way they interpret the faith.
Right.
Because faith is living and it's always changing. And these theologians are simply people who sat down and tried to give a coherent account of what all this means.
Yeah. Now, I find that when I'm having these conversations, there's certain conversations I'm having with friends from Grace Baptist, guys I used to go to Bible study with or see around town, that I'm trying to bring a theological context to political issues or political, news stories, for example, and contextualize it that way, because surely we can agree on, deferring to the authority of Scripture, for example. But there's another type of conversation I have with friends that either aren't Christians or are politically, to my left. That I don't know how to describe it, but it's almost like because I I'm kind of an out of the closet Christian, right? That I have to account for that part of my life, that part of who I am, and I feel like I have to reckon with the fact that my brothers and sisters in Christ, or maybe some people who are calling themselves Christian, that there's something else at work that I have to say, maybe we've abused the privilege here, and I don't know how do you approach those conversations with folks that either aren't Christians or what we're calling ex-evangelicals now? Do you just account for that and reckon with the kind of collective sins of what American Christianity seems to be going through right now, or create distinctions? Like, how do you go about that?
Yes, well, I'm in a really good place to have to deal with that because Union Theological Seminary was founded as a Protestant seminary. It's always been progressive, but now we're increasingly multi-religious. So we have Buddhist and Muslim and Hindu students and Sikhs, but we also have about a third of our student body are the religiously unaffiliated,
Mm,
interested in nonetheless studying the history of religion and spirituality. So we're always having these conversations with
yeah.
one. And I can't walk out of my door without having this conversation because they're all right there.
Oh,
Uh,
that's exciting.
yeah, no, it is exciting. It is exciting. And one of the first steps in that conversation, and it becomes apparent when like I have to, you dwell in that conversation over years that so many people who are spiritual but not religious, or who come from other religious traditions, if you can have a conversation about what matters most to them, what their deepest value is,
Yeah.
it's kind of startling how similar the answers are in terms of um, the importance of love and the importance of care um, for each other and for our planet. I find that across religious traditions, and I find that very much alive in the spiritual but not religious community.
No, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought of it this way before, but now that I am, some of my friends that I've been in dialogue with that are the most passionate vocal supporters of Trump. A lot of it comes from, I don't know if they would say it this way, but I care enough about some of these folks enough to recognize that they they one fellow in particular just doesn't feel like he's been seen, doesn't feel like he's been heard as an individual. That once once they see his, clean up on aisle 46 hat or, MAGA hat or whatever, that he's put in this, category and judged a certain way and not seen as an individual human being. So the idea of love with the, as translated by just being seen as an individual human being, right?
Yes.
And there are any number, including folks in my family, that I think I could. There are strains of that as well. Now that leads me to you mentioned something about what's happening at Union Theological Seminary. Another buddy of mine submitted a question. You might know this friend, my pal Samir Yadav, took courses from you at Yale when you were at Yale Divinity School. You even
Yep.
wrote one of his
There.
recommendation letters when he
Yes.
was.
Hello, Samir.
Yeah, hopefully he'll be listening. I'll let him know that we gave him a shout out. One of his questions was, how has the decline of Christianity and the crisis of membership afflicting mainline denominations affected the future outlook for standalone seminaries like Union? And is there talk of survival strategies and future outlook given the changing market and religious landscape in America?
That's a great question. So, yes. And the answer is union is, if I base it on union, it's counter trend. So, I'll start by just talking about the massive trends in the United States are away from church membership. The number of churches that are open are closing. And we're seeing the pool of applicants for theological education with the aim of getting ordained that continues to shrink. Now, at Union, and there's probably many reasons for this, our enrollments are steadily growing. And I think that is in part because while we stay true to our Protestant heritage, we open our doors wider and wider because I increasingly think that any conversation about faith, it has to be a global conversation.
Mm,
Live next door to people who don't share um, our own faith traditions. And if we can't have a school where we learn together, how can we possibly imagine living together? And so Union is doing very well. Our enrollments actually this year doubled.
oh,
Uh,
wow.
it's interesting to me. We're still trying to figure out what happened, but it may also be a response to all that's happening in our nation. And I have been reading the recent studies that are saying younger people are more interested in faith communities than older people, because I do think there is a real crisis of meaning.
Mm,
Like, what do we have to hold on to? It looks like the whole structure of moral accountability is just crumbling. And where are we going to find a place where we can gather and talk about actually what matters,
right,
not
right.
just the new executive order? Like, where do we gather to talk about what we value most and the kind of nation we want to have versus what we see unfolding around us?
Yeah. Yeah, I've been seeing that as well. If I was the theological or religious equivalent of a technical analyst on Wall Street, I think I might be recognizing a bounce off the bottom of the trowel.
Mm.
And I see it, some of the studies I've been reading, but I also see it literally in my own home. A couple of my kids are 24, 21, and 20, and I'm seeing more. They were raised in the church, went to a Christian school, but they're following their own path, and in a way, I guess 2020 especially, they separated from a lot of that, each one of them. But now, at least two of them, if not all three, are looking for a sense of transcendent, looking for community, looking for, the numinous, looking for profundity in a different way that religious traditions, whether it's my own heritage or the church traditions that they grew up in, or something else, they're finding their own way, the music scene or anything else. But they're searching, they're looking for it in a way that I didn't see as recently as 4 or 5 years ago in each of them.
Yeah.
So that's yeah, and there's actually a program there that I was going to ask you about too, because it seems to me that Union Theological Seminary is preparing folks for engaging with the world in the unique ways that we can. I don't know how you pronounce the short version of it, TIDEL, Technology Innovation and Digital Engagement Lab, which I want to apply. I want to go. So programs like that seem to be like a real thoughtful response to a need, like a groaning that we have. How do we do this in now in this time? You know,
Yes.
so
Yes. No, Title is a wonderful program that brings together people with just basic technology skills and teaches them how to do design thinking, how to bring your creativity to technology and how to bring your faith to it so you can, breathe life into what might otherwise be for your own use, a sterile medium.
mm.
And the wonderful projects coming out of Title in terms of the networks that people are building, the conversations they're enabling is really exciting.
Oh,
Uh,
that's great. Well,
yeah.
one more question I had about your career trajectory. Well, not me, actually. Samir was asking. He was curious because he knows you from your time at Yale about the transition from being a professor of theology to being an administrator as president of Union. That's a significant shift, he says, and just your sense of vocation.
Yes, that was probably the biggest single change in my entire life. Well,
Mm,
probably next to becoming a mother. Uh,
mm,
but yes, when I came to Union in 2008, prior to that, I had only been a professor. And I don't mean to say only to diminish that importance, but I had very little administrative experience. I did grow up in the household of a university administrator, but that does not mean it translated into actually understanding how to run an institution. I've been here 18 years, and I would say the first 4 years, my learning curve was so steep that when I arrived, I didn't even have any idea what it was I needed to learn, much less have just step in it with a robust sense of this is what a president does. I guess the advantage of that is Union has been very creative in thinking about how it responds to the present moment and being the first woman and also um, coming straight from the classroom. I was very open and creative about thinking about what theological education needs to be to meet this moment in time.
right. Well, you have a public voice, and I've read several pieces that you submitted to national publications about what's happening, literally right next door in your case, how you've been a leader, a voice of ethics and reason, while encouraging students. What I'm referring to are the protests that have happened following October 7th, 2023. That hits close to home for me too. I have family in Israel. I was just,
Yeah.
emailing with my cousin, one of the eldest cousin there, this morning. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I'm reading from you is that you it's almost like you're saying yes and to all of it. That meaning that we need to affirm the collective trauma that people are feeling if they identify primarily with Palestinians. But we also need to affirm our Jewish friends and neighbors, and in my case, with family there who suffered We did lose one of our family members. It turns out on October 7th, he was missing for about 3 months before we found out. But you're affirming all of the above. You're also affirming students or anyone's rights. Our in the tradition of the Bill of Rights to peaceably assemble and to speak and even redress of grievances. So that is it requires a really open heart and wide arms, right? As well as an ability to hold all of these things together. So am I imposing some of what I'm hoping you're saying on what you're saying, or is it something different than what I've been reading?
No, exactly what you're saying. Exactly what you're saying. And it's very interesting when you try to hold a big space and keep it open and fill it with love, but not run away from serious conversations about difference. That you are led to a position where, for instance, last spring at the height of the protests, we were having students from surrounding schools have their Seder in our courtyard, and we were having Eid meals during Ramadan at the end in our courtyard. And we were having retirement parties and birthday parties, but we were just an open space where people could come. And oftentimes we found that simply allowing people to have their celebrations and to connect with each other goes a long ways towards bringing some healing to what are very ruptured times.
Yeah, yeah. One of the I get glimpses of heaven, at least I think I do, that have just enough bitterness to be sweet, to be the really sweet kind. And one of these glimpses is a conversation I've been having with someone who's become a dear friend, a woman named Lisa Sharon Harper. I don't know if you know
I know.
Lisa.
I
Oh,
know Lisa.
oh,
Yes.
cool.
I can say hi to Lisa too.
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, so she and I have deep differences, but I've learned so much from the conversations that she's been having with Palestinian scholars, Palestinian Christian scholars, and some of the work that she's been doing. But you know something, what was really profound for me, and I'm getting chills just thinking about it, is it was no later than October 8th where Lisa called me, and she wasn't. It wasn't a political debate that she was looking to get into. The only thing she said was, "How you doing, brother?" That's
Yeah.
it. We
Yeah.
already knew each other for at least a couple of years at that point. So she knew my story, and we were doing some. We still do. We still work together on her awesome podcast, the Freedom Road podcast. But man, what a great way to start a hard conversation than to
Yeah.
just say, "How you doing, brother?"
Yes. And just the mere act of reaching out, and not letting what could be immediate walls go up, but just to even reach out and say, hey, how are
Yeah,
you?
yeah,
The reminder that we are all siblings.
yeah. That's right. That's right. Now, you've also had a practice of late. You've been visiting red states recently. Um, I heard you on that same conversation that I referred to before. You mentioned a trip where you spent some time with congregations in Amarillo, Fort Worth, and Little Rock. So I'm curious what brought you. Well, why would you do such a crazy thing like that?
Well, first of all, it reminds people that I am from Oklahoma. So
That's right.
these are my people I'm talking to in
Yeah.
Amarillo, Worth, and Little Rock. So I know these congregations, and I went to them all because they invited me to come.
Mm,
They're mostly progressive churches that are little tiny blue dots or purple dots in a sea of red. And all of the places that I spoke, um, I did my last long trip through these places in late February, um, was just what is it that we're called to do and be in this moment? I mean,
mm,
the sense that of kind of being surrounded by chaos in terms of the national state of affairs and being besieged by a by faith communities who um, disagree with them vociferously. And really had it boiled down to three things. I kept saying to people that's not any great wisdom, But I say, if these are three things that you can do, you're at least pointed in the right direction. And the first is, as we're told by Jesus, pay attention first and foremost to the most vulnerable people and protect them and work to protect them because we're called to care for them. Pay attention to the most vulnerable. Secondly, don't back away from your faith, but speak it ever more strongly and study it ever more deeply because your voice has to be heard. And then thirdly, and this is perhaps the hardest one, it's one we've been talking about, is never stop building bridges. Even if there's no bridge coming from the other side, you have to build bridges because as we can see, the unstable political ground we're in right now, even amongst Christians, if we're not building bridges, then we're not finding new people with which to dwell and thrive. Or I put it even more bluntly sometimes is that, and you can see this happening with Trump's ratings going down. If as a progressive person, I'm not building any bridges towards people, for instance, who voted for Trump, then all of these people who are questioning that vote are falling, and there's no one there to catch them.
Yeah.
And that's our duty, is to catch them and not force them to think one way, but to catch them in love and to have conversations about what's going on. And if we build big walls between us, then there's no one there to catch anybody.
Yeah. I'm constantly wondering what ways I'm culpable in pushing folks further into checking a particular box. You know, and the funny thing is I'm a pretty conservative guy, theologically, politically. But because I'm a conservative, I could not bring myself to vote for Trump. But I know a lot of folks who did for one reason or another. And I kind of alluded to one of those reasons is a really good friend just felt like, even thinking about that or thinking about it out loud, he's judged and kind of put in a box and just said, well, to hell with it. I'm definitely voting for him now. So that was one of his primary motivators. But I do wonder to what degree maybe some of our individually our own excesses have determined someone who might have been kind of on the fence to go one way or the other. And
Bingo. Yes, I totally agree. I totally agree. The arrogance of, I mean, progressive people are as capable of being arrogant and off-putting as anybody. And alas, they
yeah,
are saints and sinners all.
yeah,
And until we interrogate why, um, and it is true that that many people have not felt seen and have felt ignored by the Democratic Party,
Mhm.
or have felt ignored by, in the Christian community, people of faith who are more progressive. And that's just a fact that we have to accept and take responsibility for and try to undo. And I think that's particularly true for white males in this country. It's like, oh, that group is in progressive communities, it's just like they have to bear the weight for every sin of the world for since the beginning of time.
Yeah,
And that is just an unfair weight to put on anyone, and everyone deserves to be seen and treated justly and with love.
yeah. I have to admit there were some meetings that I was a part of in the summer of 2020 where it almost felt like because of the shade of my skin, if I didn't come into that meeting basically taking a flagellum to myself just for virtue of what I looked like, that I just was not, I was not welcome there. And it was off-putting. I will say that it was off-putting, and it took some time for us to, in some cases, to mend fences, to say the least. And it was also a start. The way you put it is startled and startling to build. Excuse me, startled and starting to build phase. But the startled part of it, especially at that time, we were startled and trying to make sense of the stuff that just didn't make any sense.
Yes.
So Are we, do you think we're still in the startled and starting to build phase, or are we on another phase now?
I think we are in a, if I were to, put my finger in the air and test where the wind is moving, I think the wind is pretty, it's still. I think we've moved out of startled, um, but it is a moment where we need to have an imagination in our faith that thinks out of the box. And we need to go back to our roots, and we need to sort of pause and sink deeply into those roots of faith to come up with visions and directions for our nation that we don't yet have.
Mm,
And that is hard work. I see the sort of crisis of our nation as a massive spiritual crisis for all of us. And until we're ready to engage seriously the spiritual depths of the issues that we're wrestling with, we're just going to keep crumbling, regardless of who's in power.
yeah. Yeah. And it seems that many of us, you've done a lot of work on trauma, and many of us, maybe collectively, all of us are walking in trauma, right? And actually, Tommy had a question about this. He was, here it is. He was asking how your work on trauma might shed light on the difficulties we've inherited in the U.S., especially what's arisen since the first election of Trump and everything subsequent to that.
Yes, yes. In fact, when you asked me earlier about Amarillo, Fort Worth, and Arkansas, in all three cases, I was brought in with an invitation that came a year before to talk about trauma.
Mm,
And because that is an area where I work as a theologian, mostly talking about how traumatic events impact people's lives, not just individually, but collectively, and also intergenerationally, that there are harms that sort of live in um, our society that have been there for so long, we accept them, and they become normalized traumas. And then a political situation like the one we're in right now comes up, and it just sort of makes all of that go into reactive mode, and everyone responds in a traumatic response, which is either freeze, fight, or run away, flee.
right.
And none of those three responses are going to move us forward.
So you talked about getting back to our roots. What does that look like?
Um, well, for me, in terms of congregations, it means spending time thinking about, starting with the question of, this is going to sound really silly coming from this president of a seminary, but asking the question in a moment like this, like, what would Jesus do? And having those conversations, and actually holding people accountable to answering that question. That you don't get to just say, I'm a Christian and this is what I think, and just pull it out of thin air. How do you bring that back to an account of the Jesus Christ of your faith?
Yeah.
That's a serious conversation to have, and we need to have it. But it's shocking to me how many people are reluctant to have that level of conversation.
Or they're imagining all the wrong things,
Yes.
A lot of the fellows that I get into conversations with are definitely, it's what Kristen Dumais talks about in Jesus and John Wayne. They're thinking of Jesus as like Rambo and picking up a machete in one hand and a machine gun in another, and just going and mowing them all down. And man, show me where that is, dude. Well, he turned over the tables. All right, well, let's keep reading. you know. So that's a problem. I'm realizing that we're already, man, I knew this would happen, that our time would go so quickly. So I want to be respectful of that. I do want to try to wind it down here. I'll ask you the TP&R question, talk of politics and religion without killing each other question. That is, what do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across these differences? There's people who have different backgrounds and beliefs than we do, who maybe think that Jesus is Rambo.
Yes, yes, yes,
People who
yes.
get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
it is possible and it has to be possible, or we can't move forward. And I'll just go back to the 3 points. Pay attention to the vulnerable, dig deep into your faith, and be open to building bridges all the time.
Yeah.
Never shut anybody out.
Yeah. I love it. I love it. Caring for the most vulnerable, speak your faith loudly, be bridge builders. Yeah, I've been hearing you preach it, sister, preach
Ah,
it. Do you have any questions for me?
yeah, I'm just interested how you got interested in all of this, and you ask such great questions and are clearly a very reflective Christian.
Mm.
Uh, what are you, is there things popping up from your Christianity right now that seem to be most vivid in this political moment? I
Oh
mean, you read
boy.
Micah, thank you for that, but just
Yeah.
one that comes to mind that's kind of come to the surface with a roar.
I I guess I wouldn't really be Jewish if I didn't constantly have two different opinions in my head all at the same time, or at least three, at least two, if not three or four. But it's not that I'm it's not that I'm questioning the kind of center of my faith, which is there is a God and I'm not him or her or whatever.
Very
Um,
good. That's
yeah,
a huge leap.
it's a good start, right? But what I'm wondering is how did this particular people of God, or the picture that we have in America today, how is that the result? Like, how did we get here? How did the body of Christ, or people that say that they're the body of Christ, get here? And so that's something that I really wrestle with. But then because I do read the Bible, about a chapter a day, and then I remember, oh, we've been here before.
Mhm.
you know, the it's like even the people who actually heard the voice of God from Mount Sinai.
Had to fight about it.
Yeah, yeah. So this is part of who we are, and then you read through Kings and Chronicles, and they were constantly setting up idols and stuff like that. So what I am trying to better understand, one is, what is the form of idolatry that we are prone to now? What does that look like? It's not necessarily setting up idols the way they did, like a golden calf, but there are definitely idols, and I'm coming to think that they're not idols that are 180 degrees off of what we might think of as like kind of the ideal true north, but maybe 10 degrees off, which in some ways is even more pernicious, right?
Yeah.
But then also the question is, well, so what? Like the question that you asked too about theology, the so what? So what do I do about it? How can I connect with my brothers and sisters? What do I do about it? So that's as I wrestle through scripture, and I have these conversations almost on a daily basis, if not multiple conversations a day. Yeah, how do I reckon with where we are, not just as a country, but as the people of God, and our neighbors, who are not religious? How do we do it? How do we do it?
Yes. And there's no easy answer to that. It's actually, we have to do it. So you learn to do it by starting to do it.
Yeah,
Always tell my students, theology is not just an abstraction. Actually, it's an action. It's a way of living in the world. So you have to just start doing it and discover as you go.
yeah. I was under the impression that one could come up with the right answer to every question or objection, and then you would just kind of plop it right down. And this is 20 something years ago. That's how this inquiry started when I first became a Christian. These conversations I was having with my dad about why I became a Christian. And then we got into all kinds of other stuff, history and politics, and so that's where this all came from. But that's not how it goes. The willingness to mess it up and get dirty, and get your hands dirty. And how did Pope Francis put it? It's it's more of a field hospital. I forget the what we're doing is more of a field hospital than a I forgot the analogy that he was making, but that's kind of how I see it. It's like you got to be able to get there in the dirt, you know?
Yeah. And yeah, get there in the dirt and the blood and the mess of it all. And you keep asking the questions, and hopefully over time you don't find, nice, pretty, tied up with bows answers, but you do learn to ask better questions.
Oh, yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it because I'm always kicking myself for not doing it as good as Jesus, but then reminding myself, well, that's because I'm not Jesus.
And Jesus never asked you to be Jesus.
That's right. That's a good thing. So, well, this has been a real treat, Serene.
So
I'm
much.
so glad to have gotten to know you, and I hope it's not the last time. Um,
A great
uh,
conversation.
yeah, yeah. So before we go, how can folks follow you, find more information about Union Theological Seminary's programs, and just all the great work that you're doing?
Well, we have a great webpage. If you just put in Union Theological Seminary in the city of New York, you can learn all about the school, and all of my information is on that webpage. My writings and just the various programs that we do. And one program I'm particularly excited about that's a new program that we're doing into prisons north of New York City, Sing Sing and Bedford Hills, and teaching inside carceral institutions. It really deepens, boy, does it deepen and change
Mm,
the world. So
wow.
that's our growing edge.
Good stuff. I'll be sure to put those links in the show notes. We sure did cover. We packed a lot into this hour.
Yes.
But is there anything we important we haven't discussed that you'd like to add before we go?
No, just my prayers are with you and the work you're doing, and thank you for a great conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show, write that review, and now you can watch the conversations on YouTube. It's youtube.com/ at politics and religion. And I am at Corey S. Nathan, at CoreysNathan on all the socials, as well as Substack. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.